the need to reunify the human rights agenda. What brought about this shift? How did this shift come about, this discursive shift and this normative rehabilitation of economic and social rights, if you like? It didn't just come about by itself. It didn't just come about because the UN suddenly woke up and decided that all human rights were indivisible. It's really a reflection of a growing concern and growing mobilization amongst civil society groups around these rights and around the issues that made economic and social rights come to the surface of the political agenda. And this is prompted by many factors which I probably don't have time to sketch out in full, but certainly one of the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the bipolar world was that, at least in countries of the West, of the so-called West, this made possible a less ideological and less politicized reconsideration of economic and social rights, both within the sphere of government and by civil society groups. Indeed, economic and social rights have to some extent entered the mainstream political discourse in some countries, particularly in Europe, in social democracies in Europe, because these principles were seen as underpinning the welfare state. We don't have time to go into this, but the welfare state push towards the creation of a welfare state was in some way a reaction against an inoculation against the fear of communism, of socialism. Because of that, you already had the seeds, I think, of the concept of economic and social rights in countries which previously had been hostile to it. In many regions, one of the knock-on or indirect effects of the end of the Cold War was also quite radical shifts in governance at the national level. Here I'm thinking particularly of the region I know best, which is Latin America, where the end of the Cold War also spelt the end of long periods of repressive, authoritarian, or dictatorial rule, the ending of certain armed conflicts, which had also been kind of proxy conflicts for the Cold War. Why is this relevant to economic and social rights? Well, the human rights movement operating in those contexts, for example, many years I was working in Central America, at the end of political conflicts there, economic and social rights injustices came to the surface even once the massacres had stopped, once the political repression had stopped, once the killings and the disappearances and the torture had stopped, the civil and political rights violations. These, the systemic discrimination which had fueled these conflicts, or the terrible lack of access to land or livelihoods, these problems persisted. And so if the symptoms of the conflict had ended, the underlying causes, which very often had economic and social rights dimensions to them, certainly hadn't disappeared. And so this is one of many reasons why these issues come onto the agenda more forcefully of the human rights movement, particularly in regions such as Latin America, but I would say that in other parts of the world this is a similar story. Similarly, the human rights organizations, social movements, so people concerned about social justice around this time, when we're talking about the decade of the 90s, really begin to address issues which can loosely be categorized under the heading of the harmful impacts of globalization, economic globalization. Bear in mind, this is a time when international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, are pushing certain policy prescriptions in many parts of the world, and again, Latin America is the one I know best, packages of privatization, trade liberalization, which have, now I think it's fairly well documented, have the opposite effect from that which they, I'm giving the best possible gloss, that which they claimed to have wanted to bring about. In other words, pushing more people into poverty, exacerbating social inequalities in many countries. And so this, again, this is a phenomenon that human rights and social justice organizations feel needs to be addressed through the lens of human rights. It's an era when greater attention begins to be given to the role of non-state actors, not just what the human rights for the longest time has been concerned with what the oppressive state does, and with reining in an authoritarian oppressive state. In the the 90s, you begin to see a shift beyond looking at the state and looking also at what, for example, powerful multinational corporations, how they exert a huge influence on people's economic and social rights. For example, on the impact of extractive industries in many parts of the world, not just the environmental impacts, but the impacts on indigenous people's rights, for example, of mining in the Amazon, or oil exploitation in the Niger Delta. We're all familiar with the examples. But these are I'm just explaining, these are some of the factors, the contextual factors that kind of propel economic and social rights more center stage on the agenda. And so you begin to see a range of human rights organizations beginning to address the economic and social dimensions of human rights. So, yeah. And I would say at the forefront of these are national level organizations, particularly in regions such as Latin America, which in many ways has been pioneering in this respect. Organizations such as those that I worked with very closely during the conflicts in Central America, broadening their remit to address poverty, inequality, to address some of the issues, as I say, underlying the conflicts that haven't been resolved. And you also get, several years later, mainstream international NGOs like Amnesty International, like Human Rights Watch, beginning to debate, well, should we also broaden our remit? These are basically civil and political rights organizations. Should they broaden to address these patterns of injustice? And I can tell you, as an insider from Amnesty International, that for many years, and we're talking now about the mid to late 90s, there was a lot of wariness about this, because the Cold War perceptions and myths about economic and social rights, they still lingered. Perhaps not so much for ideological reasons. It wasn't so much an ideological objection to these rights, but it was more a strategic objection, in some cases a legal objection, a methodological objection. I'll explain what I mean. There was a widespread perception, and there still is, so it's important to kind of acknowledge this, a widespread perception that economic and social rights were somehow less enforceable, less real rights, less claimable as rights than civil and political rights, because their content was less clear. I mean, okay, we all know what the right not to be tortured is, freedom from torture. But what is the right to health? What does that mean? What obligations does that pose on the government or on the state? What claims can I legitimately have? Can I demand the highest possible standard of health for myself? The content of these rights is more nebulous to some extent. An objection also, a traditional objection, is that these rights impose what are called positive rather than negative obligations. Positive obligations are those obligations which impose on the state a positive duty to do something, to act, to create conditions in which people can fulfill their rights, rather than to refrain from acting. Classic example, torture is primarily a negative obligation. Don't torture, refrain from torture. A positive obligation around the right to food is to create systems which enable people to have a degree of food security, to create food systems, etc. You see the distinction in that. And another classic objection to the recognition of these rights, or arguments that we used in places like Amnesty International not to work on these rights, included, well, they're so resource dependent. Countries in the South, in particular, cannot be held to the same standards as countries in the North, because how can you expect the right to health to be fully realized in all contexts when some countries are just so strapped for cash and so dependent either on international aid or so crushed by international terms of trade, etc., that their ability to resource these rights, the realization of these rights, is very constrained. So, and linked to that question, the awareness that the fulfillment of economic and social rights engages a broader range of actors beyond the state, and that is an undisputable fact. So all these murky factors meant that even well-meaning organizations and organizations that were seen as kind of defining the human rights agenda, like Amnesty International, were wary of taking on economic and social rights for many, many years. There were other reasons. There were also arguments that, well, the civil and political rights agenda is not finished, it's not done with. We had the war on the abuses in the context of the war on terror after 9/11. which almost, pushed many to confirm that many should be focusing just on civil and political rights at the expense of economic and social rights. I'm probably going into too much detail here, but I want to give you a flavor of the kinds of dynamics that were at play, certainly within international NGOs and to a lesser extent maybe in national NGOs. That slowness by these big players, by the Human Rights Watchers and Amnesty International of the world, that slowness led in the early to mid to late 90s to the emergence of what could be considered splinter groups. In some cases there were people who defected from Amnesty International because they wanted to work on these issues. And the emergence of specialized international organizations to work on economic and social rights for all the reasons that I outlined earlier. One of those is my own organization, the Center for Economic and Social Rights. Why don't we have a picture again, just to do a bit of propaganda. Have I mentioned I work for the Center for Economic? We can distribute these maybe at the end.
At the end.
Yeah. In fact, the Center was one of the first. We were set up in 1993, but I'm going to refrain from doing propaganda here. As well as us, there were organizations set up to work on, at the international level, to work on the right to food, FIAN, for example, on the right to housing, CORE, and many others. These organizations exist to this day, and they do excellent work in a very specialized field. And the primary aim of these sets of organizations, these new ESC rights organizations, were really, well, to expose violations, to expose the injustices that were taking place. One of our first projects was on precisely on oil exploitation by Chevron, Texaco as it was then, in Ecuador, in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and to work with people there to expose the health impacts and the livelihood impacts of that oil exploitation and pollution. To prove also that these rights were claimable and enforceable even through judicial systems, because this was part of the debate. Are these rights really enforceable? Well, we wanted to prove that they really were. There's a term that you often hear in connection with ESC rights, which is justiciability. Are any of you, have you heard that term?
I've heard it.
Yeah. Justiciability, it's a horrible word. One of the problems with human rights people is that they invent these terminologies that are just alienating. And really,
See what it means.
yeah, justiciability. Yeah. It basically means the ability to claim and enforce these rights through judicial processes. Yeah. So I'm sure they could have found a better term, but anyway. So we wanted to prove that these rights were indeed justiciable. And one way in which we did that was taking cases at the national level, at the international level. We brought the case along with a Nigerian human rights organization. You are all familiar with the case of the Ogoni in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, and Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was executed. While other organizations were campaigning against the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the civil and political rights violations that the Ogoni people were facing in the context of oil exploitation in the Niger Delta, we brought a case before the African Commission that looked at the health and environmental impacts of oil exploitation there. So very much complementing the work that others were doing. And we also sought to build activism. So we, to enable people in different corners of the globe to claim these rights, whether through the courts or out on the streets. And so one of the ways in which we did that was to create a network, an international network, which is now an independent organization, the International Network on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So all this to say that in the last decade, there have been huge steps forward in the recognition and enforcement of these rights. Greater recognition in national constitutions over the last 10 years. A huge and growing, a growing body of case law, worldwide case law, by which I mean cases brought before courts. In fact, Colombia, where Ignacio is from, is a country which has a very fine jurisprudence of case law on economic and social rights, as well as countries like South Africa and India and many other parts of the world. We can talk a bit more about that later. But so huge advances in claiming these rights with a great degree of success through the courts. And also at the international level, the normative framework of standards that I mentioned earlier has been reinforced and complemented with new oversight bodies created at the UN, for example, and to some extent in the regional human rights systems, whose role is really to clarify, to deal with